Welcome to Journey to Oz, the podcast where we share migration stories from overseas to Australia. We are both registered migration agents, Evan, who specialises in employer-sponsored visas, and myself, Nick, who specialises in family visas. Over the years, we've helped many clients who have had very interesting stories to tell. Evan, can you give us a rundown of what you'll cover today?
I interviewed Catherine Devrye, keynote speaker and Australia Day ambassador. Catherine's a best-selling author and a winner of the Australian Executive Woman of the Year award. Although when she came from Canada to Australia, she climbed a long way from being a waitress and a teacher to become such an influential figure today. I started by asking Catherine, what does it mean to be an Australia Day ambassador?
I'm always honoured every year to be an Australia Day ambassador and being sent to different towns around Australia, sometimes regional, sometimes city, where you give a speech about what it means to be Australian. You hand out citizenship certificates, you welcome new citizens to Australia, and you also hand out citizenship awards or sportsmanship awards in the local community. And it's really fascinating. I've been doing it for 16 years now, and it's an honor, and it's just great to see people join this country.
I've been to a couple myself, and it's just really, it's such an uplifting day, but then having individual interactions with people that you've never met, it's been nice just to attend them, and it's been nice to go with friends and stuff like that. But to be able to just talk to strangers and have them say how proud they are to now be an Australian, it's just such a beautiful moment.
And everybody has a story. This year I was at Scone in New South Wales regional area, and we had people from 11 different countries. It was quite a small event. Sometimes there's 100 people that are welcomed. And it's interesting because it's a much bigger deal in the rural communities than it is in the cities, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so good that they're now being able to become physically attended at the moment. I had a guy on the podcast a few months ago, and it was all done via teleconference, via Zoom, I believe. And he had set up at the table, he had set up like a meat pie and lamington, a little koala and stuff like that, and tried to make real good of the events. But yeah, as you said, it's definitely not the same.
No, it really is. It's just great to see young and old come together, and the people that are the citizens that might be given the Senior Citizen of the Year award.
Yes.
And here they are sitting next to somebody who's just become a citizen 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly right. And the junior citizens are always very uplifting as well. Well, I'd like to take it all the way back to where you were coming from to then be able to come to Australia, why you chose Australia, and what was the visa and the path for you at the time?
Well, I'm not sure, Evan, if I chose Australia or Australia chose me. And unlike many of your listeners, I didn't intentionally set out to migrate to Australia. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, in Canada, and I had my career path pretty much marked out there. I was lecturing at a university. I went straight from graduating from university to lecturing at university, and life was going pretty much according to plan. When the year I graduated, both my parents died of cancer within a year of each other.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear.
Well, it was a long time ago now, but the biggest problem of my life turned into the biggest opportunity of my life, even though I didn't see it at the time. And I think that's the case with many people who migrate to Australia. And I had no intention of migrating, but I was a teacher originally, and my best friend and her husband were on a teaching exchange in Melbourne. And I thought, I need a best friend. So I came to Australia with the backpack and $200 for a 3-month working holiday just to clear my head. The university at the stage would not give me any compassionate leave. In fact, I don't think I even knew what compassionate leave was in those days. I don't think they had it, to be honest. I really don't know. But I had no intention of staying. And one thing led to another. And as I said, the biggest problem of my life turned into the biggest opportunity of not only being an Australian citizen, but now being an Australia Day ambassador. And I think Australia is one of the most amazing countries. I'm not saying it's the best country in the world, but it's the best country in the world for me. And I've been visited over 139 countries, and I can't think of a place that's better. It's not a perfect country, but it's perfectly good for me.
Fantastic. I love that message. And it would have been hard, first coming out. Did you find it hard to be able to find your feet and be able to secure work back then?
It was a long time ago. And at that stage, there was a shortage of teachers in Australia. So teachers were on, at that stage, the government had actually offered, my friends had come out tax-free and had their airfare paid because there was a shortage of teachers. I could have come out on a similar scheme. But I thought, Australia, who'd want to live there for 2 years? I mean, I thought it was the end of the earth. And I really, my head mentally, I wasn't in the space to make any commitment for 2 years. So no, so I was very lucky. I walked into the education department down in Melbourne the second day I was here, and I got a job within about half an hour, teaching at Broadmeadows High. And for those of your listeners in Melbourne, Broadmeadows was considered the roughest school in Australia. And that didn't worry me because I grew up in a sort of so-called wrong side of the tracks in Calgary, Alberta. But I got a job, as I said, I got a job the second day I was in Australia. So I know it's much more difficult now.
Yeah. And did you find that you fell in love with Australia straight away, or was it a very slow build for you? I mean, really, you come to Australia with not much money and not much in the backpack, and you've had to go headfirst into working. Did that instant love with Australia happen, or was it something which has had to develop potentially over several years?
There was no instant love. I hated Australia. But I guess if I look back in terms of where my mind was, I wasn't happy with a lot of things in the world and life generally. I thought, this isn't fair. Why did this have to happen to me? But I thought Australia was the land of tall, bronzed Anzacs. And I arrived in Melbourne in August, freezing. And it was like, I thought it was sunny beaches. I remember getting off the plane in Tullamarine.
You've just missed it. Yeah, that time.
Well, I was freezing to death. I ended up boarding with an elderly couple in Oak Park. First, there were a lot of places had outdoor toilets in those days. I thought Australia was a third world country. It was cold. There was no central heating. I found it pretty challenging teaching at Broadmeadows. There wasn't too much I liked about Australia at all, I'll be perfectly honest. But over a period of time, a lot of things changed. And, like English was my first language, but I had trouble understanding half of what Australians were saying. And
of course.
I remember the first night I got asked, would you like to have tea? And I don't drink tea or coffee. And I said, oh, no, thank you. And I thought these Australians were rude. They're all sitting down for dinner and all I get offered is a cup of tea. And English is my first language. So I really feel for people who migrate and don't have English as a first language. But over the years, one thing led to another. I didn't last. I only taught for 6 months. I then worked as a waitress. I worked cleaning hotel rooms. Even though I had a teaching degree, I worked because I went further north up into Queensland. And anything I could do, like many migrants do, anything I could do to get a job and pay the bills. And one thing led to another. And then I got a job working for the Department of Youth, Sport and Recreation in Victoria and involved in starting the Life Be In It campaign many, many years ago. And then I'd probably been in Australia about a year before I started really liking it. I had a wonderful job. I had a wonderful boss. I had a secure job in the public service.
Yeah.
I was building a group of friends. And that's probably where was a turnaround point for me. But it wasn't instant love at all.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of migrants, they think we have, and I said, I didn't come out as a migrant. I came out just for a holiday. And then it took me a while to get enough money to get the airline ticket back to Australia. So that's why I got a job as a waitress in cleaning hotel rooms. And I think a lot of migrants have an unrealistic expectation that it's going to be perfect the day they arrive. And I think that's unrealistic.
Yeah, and you got to burn the candle at both ends. And I had a gentleman on the podcast recently, international student, and we've talked about international students before, you and I, about what you got to do for work, and you're limited to part-time hours, but then you're also studying. And, at this time of year as well, courses are now recommencing and people are getting their different schedules with their courses as well. So it's just everything happening for people, and it's definitely doesn't come easy. What sort of was the moment, the light bulb moment for yourself, where you went from disliking Australia when you first came here and had it a lot going on for you, to then be able to say, look, maybe I want to stay in Australia? And did Australia happen before the rest of your travel?
Oh, yes. I'd never been anywhere. Australia was, I went to graduate school in the United States, but I'd never been anywhere. Most of my friends after university went overseas. They did the Europe thing, the backpacking in Europe thing, but I didn't, because I had a student loan and I needed to pay the student loan back before I could even think of traveling. So no, Australia was the first well, the first place I've ever stayed. I think in those days, the plane stopped in Hawaii and Fiji and Tahiti and New Zealand. It was a long road to come. It wasn't a direct flight, but Australia, first place I'd set soil outside of North America.
So then when did your travel start for yourself? Was that when you had sort of really settled into Australia and fallen in love with Australia, or was that afterwards?
No, it was definitely after I'd well and truly had settled into Australia. I'm very privileged, I suppose, because I think my parents were migrants to Canada. My father from Holland, my mother from Scotland.
Wow, yeah.
But they traveled my mother was quite young, but her parents and my father, they traveled more out of necessity than traveling. Most of my travel has been as a tourist. And apart from my first trip to Australia, when there was pretty glum circumstances that, eventuated with me coming here. Most of my travel has been out of choice and out of holidays and also out of work. After I left the government many years later, I worked for IBM and I got posted and was living in Japan and Hong Kong working for IBM. And that made me realize how difficult it would be for people who don't speak the language, because here I was now the foreigner in Japan. At those days, I was called an alien. Alien. So I guess I've got a great appreciation for people who come and don't speak the language, because I certainly learned that in Japan.
That's experience.
And I'm fluent in charades. That's the only language I'm fluent in is charades. I can speak a bit of Japanese and a bit of French, but I became very fluent in charades.
I love that. And then, so part of your travels, as you mentioned, was for work. And to let the listeners know, I mean, you've gone on now to write 9 nonfiction books, and a handful of those have become #1 bestsellers. You've had them translated to languages spread all over the world, about a dozen languages. Can you please touch on sort of what these books cover and, a couple of your favorite key messages from those?
Well, I was an accidental, just like I guess I was an accidental Australian, I was probably an accidental author as well. The first book I wrote was in terms of helping sporting organizations get funding from, sponsorships. And then the first book that was really commercial was on living and working in Japan, because I basically wrote it as a manual to help people avoid some of the pitfalls and mistakes I'd made when I was living in Japan. It was a company manual, and then other companies in Tokyo asked if they could have it, and then a publisher approached me and said this would make a good book about living and working in Japan. And then that did reasonably well. And then that stage, going back 20 some years, there were a lot of Japanese students coming to Australia and a lot of exchanges with Japan. Now it seems to be more like China seems to be more of a, where our trading alliances lie. And then the second book, when I came back from living in Japan, I was totally committed to the concept of customer service, because in Japan, the word customer literally translates into honored guest in one's home. And when I came home to Australia,
you saw the
service standards were pretty awful. And, the quality movement was just starting, and it started in Japan. So again, I started speaking on customer service when IBM, like internally within IBM, and then IBM started charging me out to their clients on a fee-for-service basis. And then again, I was approached by publishers. Would you write people asked me for handouts initially. I said, I don't do handouts. People get them at conferences. They put them in the bottom drawer and forget about them. And then publishers asked me to write a book, and it became Good Service is Good Business. And I think it was the #1 bestseller in Taiwan, apart from any place else, strangely enough. And it became a #1 bestseller. So that launched me into the speaking service and a sort of circuit, and leaving the security of working for the government and the security of working for IBM to start my own very small business 25 years ago, about approximately.
Were you finding that the customer service focus was also being able to be good for the small traders as well?
Oh, absolutely. And what I did, I haven't, sounds like you earn a lot of money if you're a best-selling author, but in Australia, that's not so. But I've earned a good living on the speaking circuit, but mainly being hired by corporations. And I found a lot of small businesses couldn't afford to have my services. So I then put together, in those days, it was audio tapes and DVDs to help smaller businesses, but it definitely translates. Now, the book is still out there. It's in its 4th or 5th edition. I don't have any audio tapes or things like that anymore. And then after that, my clients came back and said, we're going through change. So I wrote a book on change called Hot Lemon and Honey, Reflections for Success in Times of Change, which I was pretty chuffed that Sir Edmund Hillary endorsed. And it was just short little snippets. So then I started speaking on change. And then I wrote a book on, and then my memoir, then I won the Australian Executive Women of the Year Award, and I was asked to write my memoir. And then I got asked to speak more about overcoming adversity and being perseverance and resilience. And it did quite well as well. It was a bestseller in Canada and in some parts in Australia. So and then when I went back to Canada to do the book tour, it was like it's not like the prodigal daughter returning home, and people came. Got lots of media coverage, and people from high school and university were coming out of the woodwork and going, "But how did you write a bestseller? You got expelled from English at high school." And I went, "Yeah, well, I guess I write it as I speak it. I'm not the world's greatest author or the greatest writer. I don't write beautiful turns of phrase and prose, but I've always, ever since I started my own business, my motto has been helping others help themselves. And I just hope that my books, like, they're not novels, they're not fiction, they're 100% true. And I just hope that they can help other people on their journey move forward. And, again, like in Japan, the first book was helping other people avoid the stupid mistakes I made culturally in Japan. I think all my books have had that purpose, is how it's going to help somebody else.
And that's like, it's twofold, which is able to have bestsellers and to be able to have such a far reach with what you need to tell is because of that ability and the want to help others. And not everyone has that. And then what got you to where you is the message of perseverance as well. So it's going through and sometimes people, they don't have a moment where, or something, maybe the right person at the right time, having a message which can give them that strength for perseverance.
Well, I think that's a good point, Evan, because when when my parents died, I was like, I remember the hospital, my dad died first and then my mom a month later. And the hospital said, would you like counseling or would you like medication? And I went, no, that's for crazy people or people from California. Like, we Canadian Presbyterians don't wear our heart on our sleeves. Now, That was a really stupid attitude I had, but in those days, that was the norm. There were no self-help books. There were no books on grief. There were no books on death and dying. So I read every memoir I could read, every autobiography I could read of people who'd overcome adversity. And, and I just might have got one thing out of the book. And then I would write down those messages like on like a Post-it sticker and put it on my bathroom mirror, put it on my fridge as a reminder of, other people's trauma and how they got through it and went on to bigger things. And as I said, I'm not the world's best writer, but I just really hope that, if people hear me speak or they read my books, that they just even get one thing that resonates with them. Because sometimes when you're really feeling down in the dumps, nothing makes sense.
Yes.
And you get overwhelmed by stuff and you feel that you're alone. And that's what's driven me with everything I've ever done.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. And, your memoir your best-selling memoir is becoming released as an audiobook soon. And really the story behind that is overcoming adversity and the perseverance. But you also had another release, which is Hope Happens. Can you please talk about your message in that and what the listeners can come to expect?
That came about on 9/11 because on 9/11, I was the keynote speaker at the World Airline Conference in Brisbane to 1,600 delegates. And the topic was, you can't control change. You can only control your attitude towards change. And I was at the airport waiting for hours and hours to get back to Sydney, where I live now. And a friend called to say her mother died of cancer. And to her, that was a much bigger tragedy than thousands of strangers on the other side of the world. And I've kept a journal every night since I was 16 of inspirational sayings that got me through tough times. So I started writing a letter to my friend that turned into a book called Hope Happens. And Hope Happens is the opposite of shift happens. And that's shift. Sometimes in Australia, we say shift happens, but we leave out the F.
Yes.
And but whether we've lost a loved one, we've lost our health, we've lost our wealth, we've lost our country, we should never lose hope, because hope helps us look forward. Now, I'm not talking about false hope and just sitting alone, but, I'll just sit here and hope everything gets better. I'm talking about a positive attitude combined with positive action and just taking one step at a time. But sometimes it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And that's life generally. And I know that I've done a lot of, mountain climbing and hiking. And sometimes, when I've been in Kilimanjaro, which is went for my 40th birthday, and Everest Base Camp, where I went for my 60th. Sometimes when you're going through ice or snow or shale, it's, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And I encourage people to always have those steps forward and look at the summit of where they want to go, even if they think climbing a mountain is ridiculous. Look to the summit of where they want to go, because we're all going to have those steps back. And I think when you migrate to a new country, that's very, very true as well. And I think the people that have come here recently, they've got another monumental Everest of an insurmountable obstacle in their way called COVID as well. And I think, again, it's just really always remembering when you're having those steps back to keep your eye focused on where it is you ultimately want to be, and just take one tiny little step forward every single time. And, when I lived in Japan, there was an old Japanese saying called fall 7 times, stand up 8. And I think that's very true. And my memoir, on the front cover of my memoir, Bryce Courtney, who passed away a number of years ago, but he wrote The Power of One, just a fabulous, fabulous fiction book. And he was Australia's #1 best-selling fiction author. He'd written on the cover of my memoir, a story of hope and perseverance wins the movie. And I'm not the brightest spark on the planet, but I don't give up easily. I remember that Japanese saying, fall 7 times, stand up 8. And as an author, you get used to rejection, because my memoir was rejected by so many different publishers. And ultimately it was published by Random House, which was the biggest publisher in the English-speaking world. But I had to change things along the way. It was rejected initially by them for very good reasons, because it wasn't very well written. So I had to rewrite it. And right now I've got a new book that's been rejected by a number of publishers. I just have to keep approaching different publishers and reworking it. And I think it's a little bit the same when you're migrating to a new country. Sometimes you think maybe it's the land of milk and honey, but the first job might not turn out. The second job might not turn out. The housing situation not be as you expect. It might be hard getting your kids in school. You might struggle with the language. You miss your culture, your country. You miss the food. You miss the people you've left behind. But you have to keep your eye firmly focused on that summit, why you want to do what you want to do, and keep your goals very, very much front of mind.
Yeah, because there's just so much going on in people's lives. And as you said, with the pandemic as well, just this extra element of impracticality and sometimes a very hope-sucking type aspect as well. And something which, if people can just have those key messages that they return to from time to time. I've got a couple of sticky notes that are on the whiteboard always that I just like to glance up and have a look at, and different messages that sometimes we just need to be able to refer to always have that hope there for us.
What are your sticky? What's one of your sticky? I'm going to turn around and ask a question now, Evan. What's one of your sticky messages that you've got on your whiteboard?
And one that I sometimes need to bring up sometimes is that things change if you change things, which doesn't sound very elegant, but is quite profound when you put it into practice. So that's one of them. The other one I have is, this is, if you get a chance, take it. If it changes your life, let it. So those are both, I guess, a bit hand in hand with each other. I've probably had those I feel like I was in maybe late high school and I had those, and I've just sort of carried them around with me to the desk. So,
well, words can make a difference. And when I first arrived in Australia, I was boarding with an elderly couple in Oak Park called Frank and Betty Jansen. And Frank was a real awkward sort of bloke. He was president of the Flemington Bowls Club. And that's the first time I ever heard the term shift happens, but he left out the F. But he also said to me, he said, Kath, every day above the ground is a good one. And that's something that really helped get me through bad times. Now, as I'm getting older, I probably modified every day above the ground in good health is a good one.
Yes.
But I think we need sometimes, we need some of those little, I still have some on my fridge Not so much on my fridge anymore because I've just got a new fridge that doesn't have a magnet on it. But, on the inside of my bathroom mirror, just to help keep things in the front of your mind. And, your listeners probably think, okay, it's fine for me. I'm a best-selling author. I'm very comfortable. Financially, etc. I've been fortunate to travel to 139 countries. So why would I have any problems whatsoever? Well, when you get over 60, you get some health issues. When you get over 60, you see some friends that, pass away. And also with all my work, I've earned my living for the last 20 some years speaking at conferences. I've had no conferences for over 20 years, for over 2 years now, no live events. Apart from, I luckily had an Australia Day live event this year, but that's a pro bono. And so sometimes during COVID, I've had my ups and downs. And as a motivational speaker and motivational writer, people, you're like, what do you do when you're down in the dumps? And I think back to a little quote that I again put in Hope Happens that my grandpa used to say, Kath, it's okay to be down in the dumps. Just don't stay there too long. And during COVID, some of my friends, I'd be, I was feeling flat. Yeah. I'll be honest. I missed my audience. I miss the audience and I miss the interaction as much as I miss the money almost. And one of my friends said, why don't you read your own books? And it's true. And I just went back to some of those core messages that are timeless. They stand the test of time. And, one of my favorite sayings at the moment, and I don't even need to put it on my bathroom mirror or the fridge that no longer has a magnetic. But I've mentioned earlier, I've traveled to 139 countries where I've been the stranger in a strange land and people being so kind to me. And I'm writing a new book called Timbuktu to Kathmandu, which don't have a publisher for at the moment. And I'm hopefully will find a publisher in the next 6 months or so. But one of my sayings that got me through COVID was, a bad day in Australia is better than a good day in Timbuktu.
Yes.
Because there really is such a place as Timbuktu, and it really is the end of the earth. And, I've been privileged to be there at a time when I was able to. It would be far too dangerous now, and apart from COVID, to be there. And so to me, that's one of my little mantras if I'm having what I call a first world problem. And, the computer crashes or, various things, can't go to this. I was in lockdown. I was in isolation over Christmas, not because I had COVID, but because of close contact on my surface all did. So, I've had my moments of ups and downs. It's not all, sweetness and dreams, but, that's my current little mantra.
And I think a key message from this is how you have at the bathroom mirror and I've got on the desk, having those key messages, which, as you mentioned, are timeless and you carry with you throughout life. I think they're good to have those physical reminders because they help calibrate us. Because it's sometimes having those reminders when you're not down in the dumps and you're not having a challenging day allow us to pick ourselves up a bit better when we are feeling flat. So I truly believe in having those physical reminders and like I said, sticky notes carry around on the desk and
I keep things at the front of your mind in terms of what's important, what your big goal is, like why, and whatever works for somebody, like a lot of people who may not have English as a first language, they can put it on their mirror, or on their phone, screensaver on their phone or whatever, in their own language, to keep your big goals very visible. And it might not be words. It might be just a picture. You might cut out a picture of a magazine or a picture of something that reminds you, because when you're caught in what I call brain fog, it's hard to remember where you're going, why you're on that journey. But if you've got a few things that are visual in front of mind, to me, that helps me.
And like you said, the 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, it definitely helps in that aspect as well to be able to take those steps forward.
Yeah, I think it does. And, I think when we're feeling down in the dumps, we look like it looks from the outside, especially with social media these days. Don't get me started on that. It looks like everybody else's life is perfect.
Yes.
When you look at social media, and it's not. And I think that when you're having those days that, everything's going wrong, you just need to keep your big goals, either it's a picture, it's words, it's whatever, keep them front of mind. And I think that's certainly something that's helped me, because I know when I first came to Australia, my first visa, and I know you're in the visa business, Evan, but my first visa was a permanent resident visa before I became a citizen. And to me, it just seemed like there was nothing permanent in my life. My parents had died. I worked my whole life to get a job, was a lecturer at a university. I'd given that up. And there was nothing seemed permanent in my life. And I actually don't even remember a lot of my first year in Australia, except I had mentioned
except the feelings, I guess.
Feelings that
yes.
I was drinking too much, I was eating too much, I was really not on a very positive path. And but I've had reason to reread my journals, my diaries recently, because I'm doing an update of my memoir, but that won't be out for a few years. And I'm leaving my diaries to the National Library in Canberra when I die. And so I've been going through and looking at some of them, and I'm reading things in my journal, not just my first year in Australia, but the last 40 some years. And I don't even remember some of the stuff I've written down. If it wasn't there in black and white, I'd go, oh, that wasn't me.
You wouldn't believe it, yeah.
And sometimes I would look at something and I'd have something written down of somebody who'd done me wrong, or I was really annoyed with that person. I have absolutely no recollection who that person is. If it wasn't there in black and white, I'd have no idea what it was. So sometimes when we think things are really bad, are we going to remember this in 5 years' time? Is it going to be a big deal in 5 weeks, 5 years' time? And again, by keeping your big goals visible, I think that really can help you not get bogged down in the small stuff.
You get those big goals and you think of them like let's think of them like big rocks, and you got a container and you fill that container with the big rocks first. And then life's full of all of the pebbles and the sand, which just always should fall around those big rocks, those big goals, big aspirations, and those big important aspects to yourself.
I know Stephen Covey had that in his books, probably in the 80s and the 90s, but I remember hearing it before that when I was probably at university. And to me, that was really, because we do get bogged down in trivia. We all do.
Catherine, 139 countries, and Australia is the number one home for yourself. Like you said, it's a big aspect of maybe Australia chose you instead of you choosing Australia. What do you like the most about Australia, to be able to finish up today?
I like the fact that the weather would be right up there compared to Canada. I like the fact that we're a country of enormous physical beauty. And I also think there's a beauty of the human heart that we don't always see. One of the things that really appealed to me when I first came, and still does, is we're very egalitarian. Yes, we certainly have, social stratas, but if you're willing to work hard, you're willing to get some setbacks, you're willing to, the old Australian, give it a go. I really like that. I don't like the she'll be right mate attitude, in terms of just brushing things off. But I think just as Australia gave me hope and opportunity when I felt in a hopeless situation, I still believe it's there for all people today. It's, as I said earlier, it's not a perfect country. There is no such thing as a perfect country, but we have freedom of speech. We have clean water. We have clean air. We've got to look after it. We can't take it for granted. We can't take anything in this country for granted. But I think whether we're Australian by birth or Australian by choice, we've all got opportunities in front of us. We are also always have challenges in front of us. But I really, everybody complains about politicians and everything during COVID, and I just won't even have those conversations. I said we're allowed to make a choice to change if we wish. But we actually have the right to vote. Like so many people that come here don't have that right. And I think that too often we do take this country for granted, and we focus on the negatives. And as I said, it's not perfect, but it's a perfectly good place for me. And we've got to focus more on the positives and what we do have, and not focus so much on the negative. And I really feel very strongly about that. So during COVID, when friends would say, oh, they should have done that, they should do this, they should have done that, I go, you're allowed to complain for 2 minutes, and then we're talking about something else. I'm not wasting my energy one of the things I feel very strongly about is whether we live in Australia or anywhere, we should focus on things that we can control and not waste energy whinging about stuff that are outside our control. I feel very, very strongly about that because it's just too easy to sit around and say they should do that, whether it's politicians or workmates or whatever. Focus on sure, maybe they should do that, but focus on what you can actually do, that one tiny little step at a time.
And if that's not a mantra that is on a lot of, like we said, bathroom mirrors and fridges at the moment, I'm sure it will be after the listeners have tuned in, because that's a big one as well for a lot of people. Yeah. And if not, hopefully that resonates and you've left it a good note with our listeners.
Hopefully. And again, during COVID, when all my conferences were canceled, I thought, well, what can I do? And I decided not to do the Zoom things. I think a lot of people are suffering from Zoom gloom. So I have done some podcasts, but I wasn't doing any. I only did 3 presentations where I was already committed to give a presentation, and then there were lockdowns or whatever.
Yes.
So I focused on what I could do. So I focused on writing this new Timbuktu book. I focused on turning my original memoir into an audio book, which is going to be coming out in a few weeks' time, called Hope is My Compass. I focused on, rearranging my office. I sold my office and moved it to a home office. And I focused on what I still could do. I could still go for walks within my local government area. I could still try and eat healthier. I had to remind myself of that. There were times I was probably put on a few too many COVID kilos, but I thought, no, I can't let this just creep up. I have to focus on what I can do.
Yes.
And remain, positive. And, as I said, there were times when friends said, come on, Kath, you read your own book. You're not, I was down, I was feeling gloomy, no question about it. But then I just had to remind myself. I think we all need those reminders. We all need those little
calibration. Yeah.
Calibration, the catalyst for change. Like I know when I speak at conferences, many times people would come up after and say, you changed my life today. I went, oh, sorry, because I don't believe anybody changes anybody's life. So I said, I hope I've changed your thinking, but I haven't changed your life. Only you can change your life one step at a time.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Catherine. And you've wrote close to a dozen books coming up, and you're an Australia Day ambassador. It's been an absolute privilege to be able to have this chat to you and to share a lot of those key messages to our listeners.
Well, I only just hope that just even one thing I might have said today is going to help somebody who's new to this country look forward and not look backward, because we're all faced with a choice of being victims of change or victors from change. And I think Australia gives us that choice and that opportunity to be a victor. So I just hope maybe just even one thing I've said for, I don't know how long we've been talking, 30 or 40 minutes. I just hope one thing will help at least one person move on to be a great, not just a resident of this country, but a citizen of this country, and to help give back in the future. So thanks, Evan, for the opportunity. And thanks for what you do in terms of helping other people make that transition to be an Australian citizen. It is a privilege, and we should never forget that.
And never take it for granted.
Never.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Catherine, and I appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks a lot, Evan.
Wow, what a positive and uplifting interview. I love it how she didn't initially like Australia, but then travelled to hundreds of countries and came to the conclusion that Australia had chose her. And now she's an Australian Day ambassador. So it really shows that she's gone full circle.
I really like how Catherine touched on as well that she was a bit of an accidental Australian, how she said that Australia really chose her as opposed to her choosing Australia. And she was an accidental author as well. And I love that comparison, how she just did a publication about what it's like to be living in Japan, to be able to help others. And then she ended up writing more and different topics. And now she's a best-selling author in the nonfiction section.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also like her analogy about publishing a book being like moving to a new country. I thought that was a really good analogy. And also the importance of focusing on the greater goal.
And Catherine and I spoke about attending Citizenship Day ceremonies and how wonderful they are. If you're a permanent resident of Australia and you're wanting to know if you're eligible for citizenship, or you're looking to find out that process, costs involved, processing times, feel free to reach out to myself, Evan Bishop of Worldly Migration. Our website is www.worldlymigration.com.
Thanks for listening to the Journey to Oz podcast. If you've liked what you've heard, please subscribe and also leave us a review. We will release a new episode every second Tuesday, so please stay tuned.
The Journey to Oz podcast is produced by Nick Hansen from Hansen Migration, Migration Agent Registration number 1679147, and Evan Bishop from Worldly Migration, Migration Agent Registration number 1679414. Any information discussed in this podcast is made available for entertainment purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional advice. We do not make any guarantee or accept any responsibility for the accuracy and completeness of any of the information discussed. You should obtain advice from a registered migration agent or an immigration lawyer before acting on any of the content discussed in this podcast. You can find a list of registered migration agents by visiting mara.gov.au. The information contained within this podcast may not be reproduced without our prior written consent. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of land throughout Australia and pay respects to their elders. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders today. Thank you for listening.